News PM continues now. Calls for South Africa to adequately resource its military and withdraw its troops from the Democratic Republic of Congo have intensified. This following the recent deaths of 13 SANDF soldiers in the region. The EFF's Julius Malema has demanded the immediate withdrawal of South African National Defence Force personnel to prevent further casualties. Let's unpack this further. We are with Prof. Gilbert Khadiagala, international relations expert, as well as Darren, Olivier, Director of African Defence Review. Darren, let me begin with you. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. Julius Malema says South Africa should not allow itself to be used for Western interests. The president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, accusing South Africa of representing their discussions on the Eastern Congo conflict, but also not recognizing the SADEC mission there, saying they are there for other nefarious reasons, quite honestly, saying they are actually not there for peacekeeping missions. How should we read those two statements from those leaders? One South African, one the president of Rwanda, and what is the actual fact of what is going on?
I think we should first understand that there are many competing interests here, and obviously many agendas. We need to stick to the facts of what has happened here and what has been deployed. The fact is that DRC is a force that has deployed with the full authority of SADC and the full, obviously, permission of the DRC government, and is deployed with a mandate that is very similar to the existing UN peacekeeping force there. And that mandate is to support the DRC government in helping to neutralize negative forces and armed groups. It's to support the DRC military specifically in its operations. And it's to assist in provision of humanitarian aid. And it's to protect civilian centers, such as Goma and Sake. So there's nothing nefarious about that mandate. It is certainly not one that is directed at Rwanda. It is not a threat to Rwandan territory. The only reason that that force would come into contact with Rwanda at all is if Rwandan forces are across the border, which they have been. There's plenty of evidence from the UN group of experts over the past few years showing the presence of, at times, thousands of Rwandan troops in the DRC. So I think we also need to take a step back here and realize that South Africa has been there as part of the UN mission for the past 25 years. South Africa was, in fact, one of the countries that helped to negotiate the peace talks that ended the Second Congo War, which, as we know, killed millions. So South Africa has long had a vested interest in trying to maintain some level of peace in the area, at least to ensure that the democratically elected government of the DRC is the one that controls that territory. Of course, it's nuanced. The DRC government is not itself blameless. It is a very complex environment, but generally speaking, South Africa is, in my view, on the right side of this. Speaking about the question of withdrawing, it's not that easy. The troops right now are stuck. They cannot withdraw independently. The Goma airport is closed. It is it's closed by surface missiles from Rwanda. And of course, it's occupied by Rwandan and N23 troops. So a withdrawal right now is not possible unless it's a withdrawal that is handled through negotiations and diplomacy. We therefore don't have any good options left. And this is why it's extremely important now that everybody is cautious, level-headed, and pursues the most diplomatic approach possible.
Well, we try to line up the Prof and make sure that he can hear us. I want to push this a little bit further with you there, Darren, and because you're already saying South Africa is there or has been there under the UN. And of course, we want to now bring this question that has been raised. Whose interest is the South African National Defence Force serving there? Because Julius Malema says, well, we must not be used to serve the interests of Western powers. The Rwandan president saying the force there is a belligerent force engaging in offensive combat operations to help the DRC government fight against its own people. So who is South Africa really helping?
Yeah, so again, belligerent is, I think, the wrong term to be using here. They have a very similar mandate to MONUSCO, which is to help to neutralize these armed groups which don't really have a good reason to exist. And also the argument about this being for Western mineral interests is far too simplistic. There are a number of experts in the DRC, such as Jason Stearns, who have written extensively about the real interests involved here. And part of it, yes, there are some interests in terms of illegal mining. For example, we know that a lot of coltan is illegally shipped across through Rwanda. But it's a far broader question than that. There's also an issue where Rwanda has its own security interests and economic interests that it wants to secure the Eastern DRC and still fears, at some level, groups like the FDLR, which, as we know, was formed from the former Interahamwe. So it's too simplistic to narrow this down to a question of resources and Western or any of their interests. The fact is the countries in the region have their interests, that being the DRC government, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and each of the groups, even the ones that are proxies like M23, also have their own interests involved here. So it is a complex problem, and it's really important that we don't jump to conclusions and try to look for the simplistic solution.
Yeah. Prof, the Eastern African community hosted their virtual summit. Kenya hosted it. It was attended by Rwandan President Paul Kagame, but was skipped by his Congolese counterpart, Felix Tshisekedi. Coming out of that, the EAC says, well, we will engage with SADEC on this particular mission, almost recognizing the role that SADEC is playing in this particular mission. Is this mission going to be successful without the participation of Rwanda in it?
No, the big issue here has been the lack of participation of Mr. Felix Tshisekedi to the East African meeting. I think he boycotted it because he knew that Kagame was going to be there, and Kagame was going to present precisely the same positions he's presented before, that the DRC should negotiate with M23. The DRC has consistently refused to do that. And that's what Kagame did at that meeting of the EAC. He said, you know, we have to understand the root causes of this issue, and that M23 are Congolese. And the government in Kinshasa doesn't want to negotiate with them. So if there is any, yesterday the summit of SADC summit in Zimbabwe was talking about a joint EAC SADC meeting. And they said we need an immediate joint meeting. So I don't know whether that meeting is going to happen, but true, I don't know whether President Tshisekedi would show up for that meeting. Because as I said, the simple question here is that now the M23 has been emboldened by the capture of Goma, and therefore they are going to raise their demands, the demands that they have always raised from day one, that they need to speak directly to the Congolese government. And they have been talking to the Angolans. They have been talking to the East Africans. But they have been reluctant to address the question about bilateral relations, bilateral meetings with the M23. Yeah. So maybe that the situation has changed on the ground. There could be SADC persuading Mr. Tshisekedi to begin to address that issue more directly.
So SADC, Prof, as you mentioned, having that summit, and out of it, their communique is saying that they are supporting the process that you are mentioning that has been led by the President of the Republic of Angola, what they are calling the Luanda process. What has led to that particular process collapsing in the way that it has, and what is the way back to that process?
The last substantive meeting of the Luanda process was August last year, where, again, the issues were on the table about disarming the Rwandese FDR, the people who were involved in the genocide in '94, but also the disarmament of the M23. So that was the agreement that was put on the table. But of course, you cannot implement that agreement because the Rwandese and the M23 did not take that agreement seriously. And so they were insisting that the way to proceed was to begin to disarm the FDLR before the M23 is going to withdraw. But remember that in last year, by August, July, the Rwandese had already stepped up their support by a military force. 3,000 to 4,000 people were already in the ground supporting the M23. So that means that those negotiations in Rwanda really were not very serious negotiations, because already the conflict had gotten to a stage where I think Rwanda and the M23 had decided that the Rwanda process is a non-starter, because they are not going to agree. The government in Kinshasa is not going to agree to the disarmament it's not going to agree to direct negotiations. So that, as I said from the beginning, is really the biggest point that Rwanda and the M23 have been insisting upon.
Yes.
And in those meetings, Mr. Tshisekedi and Mr. Kagame did not attend. So the Rwanda process was essentially a process of low-level mediators or negotiators from both sides of the conflict, because the two of them have not really met for quite a long time. And there are very many reasons why the two leaders have not met. So the Rwanda process can only take off if, in fact, it involves the key principles to the conflict.
Now, Darren, while we are on that, I mean, if South Africa was to say we want to contribute to a peaceful solution here, Prof saying one of the things that need to happen is to get M23 and the DRC to negotiate directly. Could South Africa play a role there?
I mean, absolutely. I think one of the mistakes of this entire process was that SADC did not apply more pressure to both sides ahead of this deployment to ensure that there was at least much more in terms of bilateral discussions between both Rwanda and the DRC and the DRC and M23. Of course, there's much mistrust. I think it's very clear, it was from what the Prof said, both the DRC and Rwanda have at times treated these talks as very much unnecessary. They haven't taken them very seriously. So it should have been recognized from the start, in my view, that there isn't a military solution to this. You have to accompany a military force. If you're going to deploy a peacekeeping force, or peace enforcement force rather, you have to ensure that it's deployed along with a robust diplomatic solution. And given what we knew about the lack of progress in the Rwanda process, that evidently wasn't done.
And right now, of course, the SADC coming in full support of the DRC and the processes that are going on there. What does that make of the little tensions, diplomatic tensions, I suppose, that are beginning to emerge between South Africa and Rwanda?
Well, South Africa and Rwanda have long had a very tense relationship. You know, South Africa accused Rwanda of murdering a dissident in Johannesburg some years back. They certainly haven't been very friendly terms. But again, looking back at this, South Africa's viewpoint on its deployment in the area, which of course, let's be clear on, is a joint deployment with SADC. It is not South Africa only. It certainly aligns with what the UN is also doing. You know, it is supporting the democratically elected government of the area. M23 might have demands and it might have some legitimate complaints, but it is not in of itself a force that has any real legal legitimacy, nor is there any legal right for Rwanda to deploy forces in the DRC. So from the point of view of international law and following a UN-led line, SADC is doing the right thing, or in theory at least, by deploying a force along similar terms. That is a different story, of course, from the wisdom of deploying the force in these conditions, and of course the lack of appropriate follow-up support diplomatically. But in terms of, again, international law, I think SADC is on the right side of this.
Yeah. Prof, does South Africa have a place in the Eastern DRC battlefield? Do they have a place to play there?
No, South Africa, as Darren was saying, South Africa has been there since day one. I mean, the mission SAMDIC was deployed last year, or let's say this from December 2023. So it's almost a year. They have been there militarily, but I don't think they have been there diplomatically. And the reason being, the diplomacy was left to the so-called Rwanda process. The SAMDIC was there in a very ambiguous mission. It's there as a peacekeeping, but it's also there as a peace enforcement. And that's why they have been involved in the fighting of M23. So that ambiguity of that mandate has to be resolved. The SADC mission has to decide whether, in fact, it's primarily a peacekeeping force. That means staying very much out of the conflict between M23 and the Congolese army, or it has to decide whether it's a peace enforcement mission, which is involved alongside the Congolese military to defeat the M23. And my reading is that they have been there mostly doing the peace enforcement and the peacekeeping. So South Africa needs really to put more pressure on the Congolese because South Africa has more leverage over the Congolese because it leads the SADC mission.
Right.
It has to persuade Mr. Tshisekedi to begin to address some of the grievances of the M23. And I think this has been the position, even I think of the Rwandese from day one, that these people are Congolese. They need to be treated as Congolese. They need to be brought into some political process. It can't just be a Luanda process that doesn't really, is never going to be implemented because the point is going to be around how do we bring the government in Kinshasa to the table with M23? And South Africa, I think, has a lot of leverage over the Tshisekedi government on that very, very issue. And now that the situation has changed on the ground, and now that M23 claims it's going to want to defeat or to march on to Kinshasa, because they are now marching on to Bukavu. I saw a UN report last night that there were 50 kilometers from Bukavu. That means they are really trying to put more pressure on the government in Kinshasa to negotiate.
Right.
And I think this is what SADC can contribute to this process, get it more political rather than military. And Darren was correct. There's no military solution to this conflict. And everybody has said that from the beginning.
Prof, appreciate your time. Let's leave you there. Prof. Gilbert Khadiagala, international relations expert at VERS, as well as Darren Olivier, director of the African Defence Review. What's happening in the world of sports with Kwena in a moment. Stay with us.